There is a specific kind of blindness that infects arrogant men. The fatal mistake of confusing a woman's quiet grace with weakness. For 5 years, Richard looked at his wife and saw nothing but a comfortable shadow, a background character in the movie of his own meteoric rise to success. He discarded her the moment he felt she no longer matched the billion-dollar image he was trying to project. He thought he was cutting dead weight. He thought she would fade into the miserable obscurity reserved for forgotten ex-wives. He was spectacularly wrong, because the woman he threw away wasn't just the foundation of his entire empire. She was about to become the undisputed queen of another man's world. The rain in Seattle was relentless that Tuesday, hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 44th floor conference room at Davis Wright Tremaine, one of the city's most ruthless law firms. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder than the November chill creeping off Puget Sound. Farrah Hayes sat perfectly still in a leather chair that felt too large for her, her hands neatly folded in her lap. Across the mahogany expanse sat Richard Sterling, her husband of 5 years, or, as of the signature she was about to provide, her ex-husband. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit, checking the Rolex Daytona on his wrist with an exaggerated sigh. He looked every inch the tech visionary the Wall Street Journal had recently dubbed him. He was handsome, sharp-jawed, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had once tricked Farrah into loving him. "Let's wrap this up, Farrah," Richard said, his voice carrying the bored, clipped tone of a CEO dealing with a minor logistical annoyance. "I have a board meeting at 2, and Vanessa has secured a table at Canlis for dinner. I'd rather not be late to my own celebration." At the mention of Vanessa, Farrah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Vanessa Croft was Richard's head of public relations, a woman whose towering stilettos and perfectly blown-out blonde hair were practically glued to Richard's side for the past 8 months. The affair hadn't even been hidden well. Richard had simply stopped trying, operating under the arrogant assumption that Farrah was too dependent on him to ever leave. When Farrah had finally packed her bags and served him papers, Richard hadn't begged her to stay. He had laughed. "The settlement is more than generous," Richard's attorney, a shark-eyed man named Gregory, stated smoothly, sliding a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. "Mr. Sterling is offering a lump sum of $150,000, the 2018 Volvo, and he has agreed to pay off the remaining balance of your student loans. In exchange, you waive all rights to alimony, and crucially, all claims to equity in Sterling Tech." Farrah looked down at the documents. 5 years. When they had met in a dingy coffee shop near the University of Washington, Richard had been a charismatic but failing business major with a half-baked idea for data synchronization software. Farrah had been a brilliant, introverted computer science prodigy. While Richard was out networking and playing golf, Farrah had spent 3 grueling years in their cramped apartment on Capitol Hill, writing every single line of the underlying code for what would become Sterling Sync, the software that was currently revolutionizing cloud architecture. She had done it for him. She had put the patents in his name, trusting him, loving him, believing they were building a life together. "You're giving me pennies on a company evaluated at $300 million, Farrah said, her voice quiet but frighteningly steady. "A company built on the architecture I designed." Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Farrah, please, don't embarrass yourself. You helped with some basic debugging in the early days. You were a supportive wife, and I am compensating you for that support. But let's live in reality. I built Sterling Tech. I secured the venture capital. I am the face of the brand. What are you going to do? Tell a judge you coded a multi-million-dollar algorithm from our kitchen table while baking sourdough?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into a cold, contemptuous glare. "Take the deal, Farah. If you fight me, I will drown you in litigation. I have a legal team that costs more per hour than you've made in your entire life. You'll walk away with absolutely nothing. You are nothing without me. Be smart and take the severance package." Farah stared at him. She looked at the man she had loved, searching for any trace of a soul, any flicker of the boy who used to split a $6 plate of pad thai with her and dream of the future. There was nothing left but a corporate sociopath drunk on his own press clippings. Slowly, Farah reached into her purse and pulled out her own pen. It wasn't a Mont Blanc like Richard's. It was a simple, chewed-up blue ballpoint she used when deep in a coding trance. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't scream about the late nights, the stress-induced migraines, or the brutal betrayal of finding Vanessa's Cartier earring on her nightstand. She knew the golden rule of software. If the foundation is fundamentally flawed, you don't try to patch it. You scrap it, and you start over. With a fluid, decisive motion, Farah signed the papers. She signed away the money, the house in Medina, and the company she had birthed from her own genius. Richard smiled, a smug, victorious smirk that made Farah's stomach churn. "Good girl," he patronized, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "It's for the best. You always preferred a quiet life anyway. Maybe you can finally get a receptionist job somewhere. Use me as a reference if you need to." Farah stood up. She picked up her battered leather tote bag, the only item she was taking with her besides the clothes on her back and her personal laptop. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. "Have a nice life, Farah." He dismissed her, already pulling out his phone to text Vanessa. As Farah walked out of the opulent law firm and stepped into the relentless Seattle rain, she didn't feel broken. Instead, a strange, electric sense of liberation washed over her. Richard thought he had stripped her of everything. He had forgotten one crucial, fatal detail. He didn't know how his own software worked. And Farah hadn't just written the code for Sterling Tech. She was the only one in the world who knew how to evolve it. 3 months later, the damp chill of late winter still clung to the city. Farah was living in a microscopic studio apartment in the Belltown neighborhood, paying her rent by taking on freelance debugging contracts under a pseudonym. Her days were a blur of cheap black coffee, instant ramen, and glowing screens. But her nights belonged to Project Ether. Sterling Tech was built on a static algorithm. It was brilliant for its time. But Farah knew that the cloud computing industry was rapidly shifting toward predictive neural networking. Before the divorce, she had started sketching out a completely new architecture, an AI-driven synchronicity model that would make Sterling Tech's flagship product look like a rusty abacus. When Richard kicked her out, she took the intellectual property with her, locked safely inside her own mind. For 90 days, she hardly slept. She coded with a ferocious, vengeful energy. Every time she felt tired, she remembered Richard's smug face. Every time her fingers cramped, she pictured Vanessa Croft wearing the diamond tennis bracelet Farah had helped pay for. The anger was a clean, burning fuel. By March, Project Ether was complete. It was elegant, flawless, and light years ahead of anything currently on the market. But Farah was a realist. She had no capital, no connections, and her legal name was entirely unknown in the tech sector, thanks to Richard keeping her hidden. She needed a backer, someone powerful enough to launch the product and immune to Richard's influence. There was only one man in the Pacific Northwest who fit the bill, Fidelia Kensington. At 38, Fidelia Kensington was the elusive, brilliant CEO of Kensington Holdings, an apex predator in the venture capital world. Unlike Richard, who courted the paparazzi and threw lavish parties, Fidelia was notoriously private. He was old money mixed with a terrifyingly sharp intellect, a man who rarely gave interviews but dictated the tides of the global tech market from his fortress-like office in Bellevue. It was rumored that Fidelia was actively searching for the next big leap in cloud infrastructure. Farah didn't try to get a meeting through regular channels. Instead, she bypassed Kensington Holdings' firewall, a polite, untraceable intrusion, and dropped a heavily encrypted zip file directly onto the secure server of Fidelia's chief of staff. Attached was a simple text file. "Run this in your sandbox. It uses 1/10 the processing power of the current market leader and operates with zero latency. If you want the decryption key for the back-end architecture, meet me at the flagship Starbucks Reserve Roastery on Pike Street. Tuesday, 7 a.m. Come alone." CH. It was a massive gamble. They could ignore it. They could report the breach to the authorities. On Tuesday morning, Farah sat at a small wooden table near the roasting vats, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of dark roast, her heart hammering against her ribs. By 7:15 a.m., she thought she had failed. Then, a man walked through the brass doors. Fidelia Kensington was taller than his rare photographs suggested, with dark, silver-flecked hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He wore a dark navy cashmere coat over a simple charcoal suit, radiating an aura of quiet, intimidating authority. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto Farah with unnerving precision. He approached her table and didn't ask if the seat was taken. He simply sat down, placing a sleek black tablet on the table between them. "You bypassed a military-grade security suite to drop a file that looks suspiciously like a Trojan horse," Fidelia said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, smooth but entirely devoid of pleasantries. "My lead security engineer spent 48 hours trying to reverse engineer your code. He ended up throwing his keyboard against a wall. Who are you?" Farah met his intense gaze without flinching. "My name is Farah Hayes, and you're here because my code ran perfectly, didn't it?" Fidelia's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of genuine intrigue breaking through his stoic facade. "It did. It's impossible, but it ran. You've solved the latency issue that every major tech firm in Silicon Valley is currently bleeding billions trying to fix." He leaned forward, dropping his voice. "Where did you steal this from, Miss Hayes?" "I didn't steal it," Farah said, her voice laced with quiet steel. "I built it, every single line, just like I built the foundation for Sterling Tech." Fidelia paused. He was a man who knew everything about everyone, but this piece of information clearly caught him off guard. Richard Sterling's company? The industry consensus is that Sterling is a solo genius. There's never been mention of a co-founder, let alone a wife. "Ex-wife," Farah corrected softly. "Richard is a salesman, Mr. Kensington, a very good one, but he couldn't code a basic HTML web page if his life depended on it. I was his ghostwriter. And 3 months ago, he divorced me, kept the company, and told me I was nothing." Fidelia studied her face. He looked past the tired shadows under her eyes, past the cheap thrift store sweater she was wearing. He saw the fierce, unyielding intellect burning in her eyes. Fidelia had spent his life surrounded by charlatans, sycophants, and loudmouths. The woman sitting across from him was entirely different. She was a weapon that didn't know how lethal she was yet. "Why bring this to me?" Fidelia asked softly. "Because you have the infrastructure to launch Ether globally," Farah replied. "And because I know Richard is currently courting you for a Series C funding round. His software is degrading. The patches he's trying to implement are failing because he doesn't understand the root architecture. He needs your money to survive." Fidelia let out a low, appreciative chuckle. It was a dark, dangerous sound. "You don't just want to build a company, Miss Hayes. You want to execute a hostile takeover of your ex-husband's entire life. I want what is fair, Farah said evenly. I want to be recognized for my own mind. Will you partner with me, Mr. Kensington? Fidelia didn't hesitate. He held out a large, firm hand. Call me Fidelia. And yes, Farah, we are going to build an empire, and we are going to burn Richard Sterling's legacy to the ground. Over the next 6 months, Farah's life transformed completely. She was moved out of her dingy apartment and into a stunning, glass-walled penthouse in Bellevue, courtesy of Kensington Holdings. She was given unlimited resources, a team of 50 top-tier developers who worshipped the ground she walked on, and a corner office right next to Fidelia's. They worked side by side, day and night. Farah found herself fascinated by Fidelia. Unlike Richard, who demanded constant praise and validation, Fidelia was deeply respectful. He never interrupted her. He challenged her ideas, pushed her to be better. And most surprisingly, he listened to her. Late nights ordering takeout from Ascend Prime turned into deep conversations about their pasts, their fears, and their dreams. Farah learned about Fidelia's demanding father and his drive to build something meaningful. Fidelia learned about Farah's capacity for loyalty and her hidden, sharp wit. One evening, at 2 a.m., while going over the final deployment sequence for Ether, Farah fell asleep at her desk. She woke up to find Fidelia gently draping his own cashmere jacket over her shoulders. His hand lingered on her arm, his thumb softly brushing her skin. When she looked up, the intense, guarded businessman was gone. The look in his eyes was naked, profound, and overwhelmingly tender. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, Farah," he whispered, before leaning down and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. She wasn't just his business partner anymore. Without either of them planning it, Farah had become the center of Fidelia Kensington's world. And the world was about to find out. The annual Pacific Northwest Tech Innovation Gala was the crown jewel of the Seattle Tech social calendar. Held in the grand, opulent ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, it was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and billionaires in tuxedos. This year, the stakes were incredibly high. Richard Sterling stood near the ice sculpture, tightly gripping a glass of Macallan 25. He looked immaculate in his custom Brioni suit, but the heavy bags under his eyes betrayed him. Sterling Tech was in a state of silent freefall. The servers were crashing weekly, clients were threatening to pull their contracts, and his lead engineers were threatening to quit because they couldn't untangle the spaghetti code without the original architect. Richard desperately needed an injection of capital from Kensington Holdings to hire a massive crisis team. He had been leaving voicemails for Fidelia Kensington for 2 months, receiving nothing but polite, non-committal emails from his assistants. Tonight was his only chance to corner the billionaire in person. Hanging off his arm was Vanessa Croft, draped in a backless emerald green silk gown that screamed for attention. "Richard, relax," she purred, sipping her champagne. "You're the golden boy of Seattle. Kensington would be a fool not to back you. Just flash that smile and remind him of your valuation." "You don't understand, Vanessa," Richard snapped, his temper fraying. "The valuation is based on projections we are currently failing to meet. If I don't get his backing tonight, we miss payroll by Q3. At that moment, a ripple of hushed whispers swept through the grand ballroom. The string quartet seemed to play a little softer. The heavy, gilded oak doors at the top of the sweeping staircase had opened. Fidelia Kensington had arrived. He looked devastatingly handsome, wearing a classic, razor-sharp black tuxedo that put the rest of the room to shame. But it wasn't Fidelia who caused the murmurs. It was the woman walking beside him, her hand resting confidently in the crook of his arm. Richard squinted through the crowd, trying to get a look at the mysterious woman who had managed to tame the notorious bachelor. As the couple slowly descended the stairs, the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Richard's heart suddenly stopped. The glass of Macallan slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor and splashing his polished Italian leather shoes. "Oh my God, Richard, your shoes!" Vanessa gasped, jumping back. But Richard couldn't hear her. All the air had been sucked from his lungs. It was Farah. But it wasn't the Farah he knew. Gone was the mousy, exhausted woman in oversized cardigans and messy buns. This woman was a vision of breathtaking, lethal elegance. She wore a bespoke, midnight blue velvet gown by Oscar de la Renta that hugged her curves flawlessly, the deep color making her skin look like porcelain. Her hair, usually tied back in a hurried knot, fell in rich, cascading waves over one bare shoulder. Around her neck rested a necklace of flawless, pear-cut sapphires that caught the light of 1,000 chandeliers. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked entirely, utterly untouchable. "Who is that?" a rival CEO standing next to Richard whispered in awe. "Good Lord, she's stunning." "That," Richard choked out, his throat suddenly completely dry. "That's my ex-wife." Vanessa froze, her manicured claws digging into Richard's bicep. "What? That's the frumpy little housewife you paid off. You have got to be kidding me." Fidelia led Farah through the room, introducing her to senators, tech moguls and venture capitalists. Whenever he introduced her, he didn't just stand beside her. He looked at her with a level of adoration, respect, and deep, possessive pride that made the other women in the room green with envy. Farah held court perfectly, her laughter light, her eyes sparkling with a confidence Richard had never allowed her to have. Richard felt a sickening cocktail of possessiveness, jealousy, and sheer panic rising in his chest. What was she doing here? And how in the hell was she on the arm of the man holding the financial guillotine over Richard's neck? He had to fix this. He had to remind Farah of her place. He puffed out his chest, pasted on his most charismatic, arrogant smile, and aggressively pushed his way through the crowd towards them, dragging a bewildered Vanessa behind him. "Fidelia! Great to see you!" Richard boomed loudly, ignoring Farah entirely as he extended a hand. "I've been trying to get on your calendar for weeks. We need to talk about Sterling Sink." Fidelia Kensington slowly turned to face Richard. He didn't take the extended hand. Instead, his stormy grey eyes swept over Richard with the detached disgust of a man looking at a cockroach. "Sterling," Fidelia said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "I received your proposals. I threw them in the shredder." Richard's fake smile faltered. "Fidelia, be reasonable. Our Q1 numbers. Your Q1 numbers are a work of fiction," Fidelia interrupted, his tone laced with lethal calm. "Your software is collapsing, and you and I both know why." Fidelia finally turned his gaze to Farah, his expression softening instantly into a look of profound warmth. He reached out, gently taking Farah's hand and bringing her knuckles to his lips for a brief, intimate kiss right in front of Richard. "Richard," Fidelia said, turning back to the pale, sweating CEO. "You're acting as if you hold the keys to the future. But you seem to have forgotten that you threw the architect out with the trash." Before Richard could stammer out a response, the microphone on the grand stage at the center of the ballroom squealed. The master of ceremonies was calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please direct your attention to the stage. We have a very special, unannounced keynote presentation. Please welcome the CEO of Kensington Holdings, Mr. Fidelia Kensington." The crowd erupted into applause. Fidelia looked down at Farah, a secret, triumphant smile passing between them. "Ready, darling?" he murmured. "More than ready," Farah whispered back, her eyes shining with a fierce, beautiful light. Fidelia walked up the steps to the stage, adjusting the microphone. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. Everyone knew that when Fidelia Kensington spoke, billions of dollars shifted. "Good evening," Fidelia's voice echoed through the grand hall. "I am not a man who wastes time on incremental progress. I look for revolutions. For the past 6 months, Kensington Holdings has been secretly funding a project that will render current cloud synchronization technology, including products heavily marketed by some in this very room, completely obsolete." He looked directly at Richard Sterling. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "But I cannot take credit for this innovation," Fidelia continued, his voice swelling with pride. "The genius behind this new era of technology is a woman who was forced to hide in the shadows of a lesser man's ego. A woman whose brilliance is only matched by her grace, her resilience, and her absolute refusal to be broken." Fidelia extended his hand toward the floor, looking directly into Farah's eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to introduce the true founder of the underlying architecture you've all praised for years, the creator of our new flagship company, EtherTech, my equal partner in business, and the future Mrs. Kensington. Please welcome the brilliant Farah Hayes." The morning after the Pacific Northwest Tech Innovation Gala, the silence in Richard Sterling's Medina mansion was deafening. By 6 a.m., the story had already broken. TechCrunch ran the headline, "The Silent Architect: How Sterling Tech's Discarded Ex-Wife Built the Future of Cloud Computing." Forbes followed suit an hour later, with a brutal op-ed questioning the legitimacy of Richard's entire career. Richard sat at his massive glass dining table, staring at his iPad with bloodshot eyes. His phone had been vibrating incessantly since midnight. Board members, furious investors, and panicked clients were demanding answers he didn't have. Vanessa Croft paced the length of the kitchen, her previously flawless blowout a frizzy mess. She was aggressively texting on her phone, her designer heels clicking frantically against the imported Italian tile. "We need to spin this, Richard," she snapped, not looking up from her screen. "We issue a press release stating Farah was a disgruntled former employee who stole proprietary algorithms. We paint Kensington as a predatory billionaire who manipulated a vulnerable, bitter ex-wife to steal our market share." Richard looked up, his face pale and drawn. "Do you think Fidelia Kensington cares about a press release, Vanessa? He just publicly humiliated me in front of every major player in Silicon Valley. He has unlimited capital. We have 3 months of runway left." "Then sue her," Vanessa yelled, finally dropping her phone. "Call Gregory. Get an injunction. Shut down EtherTech before they can officially launch their beta." It was a desperate play, but it was the only one he had. Richard dialed his lead attorney. Gregory answered on the second ring, sounding utterly exhausted. "Tell me you have a draft for an emergency injunction," Richard barked, slipping back into his familiar, demanding persona. "I want Farah tied up in litigation until she's 50. I want a restraining order on Kensington Holdings using our IP." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Richard," Gregory said, his voice completely devoid of its usual shark-like confidence. "I spent the entire night reviewing the original patent filings for Sterling Sync, the ones you signed 5 years ago." "And?" Richard demanded, his stomach tightening. "And we have a catastrophic problem," Gregory sighed. "Farah didn't file the core architecture patents under your name, or even under Sterling Tech." "What are you talking about? Of course she did. I own the company." "You own the shell, Richard," Gregory explained, speaking slowly as if to a child. Farah filed the foundational patents under a separate LLC, C-Square Innovations, 4 months before you two were legally married. The IP was never community property. C-Square Innovations granted Sterling Tech an exclusive but conditional license to use the code. Richard's blood ran cold. Conditional on what? Conditional on Farah Hayes maintaining active, unhindered access to the source code as Chief Technology Officer, a title you never formally gave her, but which she occupied in practice. When you locked her out of the servers, fired her, and finalized the divorce, you violated the terms of the lease. The license automatically reverted to C-Square Innovations, which is wholly owned by Farah. The iPad slipped from Richard's hands, clattering against the glass table. "You're my lawyer. How did you not see this during the divorce settlement?" "Because you explicitly ordered me not to audit the technical assets," Gregory fired back, his own panic bleeding through. "You said, and I quote, 'It's just some back-end garbage. Don't waste billable hours on it.' You signed the severance paperwork declaring you had full ownership without doing due diligence. Farah didn't steal your code, Richard. She took her property back. Legally, Sterling Tech is currently operating on stolen, unlicensed IP. If we sue her, she will counter-sue for copyright infringement, and she will win. It would bankrupt you by Tuesday." Richard hung up the phone. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a freezing tidal wave. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had blindly signed away the very foundation of his empire because he was too arrogant to read the fine print. He looked over at Vanessa. She had stopped pacing and was staring at him, her eyes wide as she listened to his side of the call. The calculation in her gaze was immediate and ruthless. Without a word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the grand staircase. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, his voice cracking. "To pack," Vanessa replied coldly over her shoulder. "I'm a PR director, Richard. Not a miracle worker, and I certainly don't tie my career to a man who doesn't even own his own product." By noon, Vanessa was gone, taking her Cartier jewelry and her connections with her. By 2 p.m., the board of directors convened an emergency vote. By 4 p.m., Richard Sterling was officially removed as CEO of the company he thought he built, locked out of the building by the very security team he had hired. While Richard's world disintegrated into ash, Farah's was ascending to the stratosphere. The launch of EtherTech wasn't just a success, it was a paradigm shift. Within 72 hours of the gala, the top 5 clients of Sterling Tech, including a massive logistics contract with global shipping giant Maersk, had terminated their agreements with Richard's crumbling firm and signed multi-year, 9-figure contracts with Ether. Fidelia Kensington and Farah Hayes became the undisputed power couple of the tech world. They were featured on the cover of Wired and Time, an unstoppable alliance of bottomless capital and unmatched genius. But for Farah, the most profound change wasn't the money or the sudden fame. It was the way she felt when she woke up in the morning. For 5 years, she had lived in a state of anxious subservience, dimming her own light so Richard wouldn't feel insecure. Now, walking into the sleek, high-tech corridors of Kensington Holdings, she felt an absolute, unshakable power. Fidelia never hovered. He never micromanaged her. He stood beside her, a towering pillar of support, watching with deep pride as she commanded boardrooms filled with veteran executives. A month after the gala, Farah was working late in her corner office. The Seattle skyline glittered outside her window, a sea of diamonds against the night sky. Fidelia was in his own office down the hall, finalizing an acquisition. The security intercom on her desk chimed softly. "Ms. Hayes, I apologize for the interruption," the voice of the lobby security chief said. "But there is a Richard Sterling down here. He bypassed the outer perimeter by tailgating a delivery driver. We are prepared to escort him off the premises, but he is demanding to speak with you. He says it's an absolute emergency." Farah paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. A year ago, the mere sound of Richard's name would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety. Now she felt nothing but a clinical, detached curiosity. "Send him up to my office, Marcus, but have 2 guards wait right outside the glass." "Yes, ma'am." 5 minutes later, the frosted glass doors of her office slid open. Richard walked in, and Farah almost didn't recognize him. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a wrinkled trench coat and a desperately disheveled appearance. He smelled faintly of stale scotch and bitter regret. He stopped in the center of the expansive office, taking in the magnificent mahogany desk, the panoramic views, and finally, Farah. She sat back in her ergonomic chair, impeccably dressed in a tailored white silk suit, looking at him with the calm neutrality of a judge. "Farah," Richard breathed, his voice trembling. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Thank God, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. They blocked my number." "State your business, Richard," Farah said smoothly. "I have a deployment scheduled for 0200 hours, and my time is currently valued at roughly $4,000 a minute." Richard flinched at the coldness in her tone. He tried a different tactic, putting on the wounded, charming face that had won her over in college. "Farah, please, it's me. I know you're angry. I know I hurt you with Vanessa, but this is too far. The board ousted me. They're liquidating the assets. The Medina house is in foreclosure. I have nothing." He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a desperate whisper. "You proved your point. You won. Now please, tell Fidelia to back off. License the IP back to me. We can fix this. We were a team once, remember? We built this dream together in that tiny apartment on Capitol Hill." Farah stared at him. It was fascinating, in a morbid way, to watch a narcissist try to rewrite history when they were cornered. "We didn't build anything together, Richard," Farah said softly, her voice carrying the lethal precision of a scalpel. "I built the software. You built an illusion. And you believed your own illusion so completely that you threw away the only person who actually understood the reality." Richard's face flushed red with a sudden, ugly flare of anger. "You think Kensington actually cares about you? You think a billionaire like him wants a washed-up, 30-something coder? He's using you, Farah. He's using you to crush his competition. Once Ether goes public, he'll discard you exactly like I did." "Are you quite finished?" The deep, resonant voice cut through the room like thunder. Richard spun around. Fidelia Kensington stood in the doorway, his imposing frame blocking the exit. He wore a dark, tailored suit, entirely unruffled, but his eyes were dark and terrifyingly cold. He didn't look angry. He looked like a predator calculating the exact angle needed to snap a prey's neck. Fidelia walked slowly into the room, coming to stand directly behind Farah's chair. He didn't look at Richard. Instead, he placed a gentle, grounding hand on Farah's shoulder. The immediate physical contrast between the 2 men was staggering. Richard, frantic and sweating, and Fidelia, an immovable mountain of quiet power. "I was going to have security throw you out into the rain, Sterling," Fidelia said, his voice dangerously low. "But Farah is the CEO of this division. It is her office, her company, and her decision." Fidelia looked down at Farah, his expression softening entirely. "Do you need me to handle this, darling?" Farah reached up, placing her hand over Fidelia's, where it rested on her shoulder. She gave it a reassuring squeeze. "No, Fidelia. I've got this." She stood up, walking around her desk until she was mere feet from Richard. She was shorter than him, but in that moment she seemed to tower over him. "You came here hoping to find the girl you manipulated, Richard," Farah said, her voice echoing in the silent office. "You thought you could leverage my emotions because you assume every woman is as weak and dependent as you needed me to be. But here is the absolute truth." She leaned in slightly. "I don't hate you. Hate requires energy. Hate requires me to care about your existence. I look at you, and I feel absolutely nothing. You are a bad line of code that I have successfully debugged from my life." She turned back to her desk and pressed the intercom button. "Marcus? Mr. Sterling is leaving now. Please ensure he doesn't ever step foot within a 5-block radius of this building again." Richard's jaw worked silently. He looked from Farah's impenetrable, confident face to Fidelia's lethal, warning glare. The grand illusion of Richard Sterling finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Without another word, stripped of his dignity, his company, and his pride. Richard turned and walked out the door, flanked immediately by 2 towering security guards. As the glass doors slid shut, the heavy tension in the room evaporated. Fidelia let out a slow breath, a deep, genuine smile spreading across his handsome face. He walked over to Farah, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. "Remind me never to cross you in a boardroom, Mrs. Kensington-to-be," Fidelia murmured, kissing the top of her head. "That was the most ruthlessly beautiful thing I have ever witnessed." Farah leaned into his embrace, closing her eyes as she listened to the steady, reliable beat of his heart. "I had a good teacher," she whispered. "No," Fidelia corrected softly, tilting her chin up so she had to look into his eyes. "You already had it in you. I just gave you the castle. You were always the queen." The rapid ascent of Ether Tech was gearing up for the most anticipated initial public offering, IPO, in the history of the Nasdaq. Wall Street analysts were projecting a valuation that would make Farah Hayes one of the wealthiest self-made women on the planet. But cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Richard Sterling had nothing left to lose. Evicted from his Medina mansion and bleeding legal fees from the dissolution of his company, Richard was holed up in a grim, fluorescent-lit motel near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey clung to his clothes. He spent his days obsessively refreshing the financial news, watching Farah and Fidelia's faces dominate every screen. The humiliation had festered into a toxic, blinding obsession. He needed to destroy her. He found his weapon in Silas Montgomery. Silas was the CEO of OmniCloud, a legacy data firm that was hemorrhaging market share to Ether Tech. Silas was notorious in Silicon Valley for playing dirty, funding smear campaigns, short-selling competitors' stock, and utilizing corporate espionage. Richard arranged a clandestine meeting with Silas in the dimly lit back room of a dive bar in Tacoma. "I don't just want her reputation ruined, Silas," Richard hissed, sliding a manila folder across the sticky table. "I want the IPO halted. I want Kensington Holdings investigated by the SEC." Silas flipped through the documents, a predatory smile stretching across his face. Inside the folder were thousands of fabricated emails, meticulously doctored by a black hat hacker Richard had hired using the last of his personal credit lines. The emails painted a devastating, entirely false narrative. That Farah and Fidelia had been engaged in a multi-year, illicit affair long before the divorce, and that they had conspired to intentionally sabotage Sterling Tech from the inside, defrauding investors to artificially inflate Ether's value. "This is good," Silas murmured, tapping his manicured fingernail against the forged digital signatures. It gives OmniCloud the perfect window. If the SEC catches wind of insider fraud and marital embezzlement, Ether's IPO will be frozen indefinitely. Their stock will tank before it even lists, and my hedge fund buddies will short it into oblivion. "Just make sure the press gets it tomorrow," Richard demanded, his eyes wide and manic. "The day before they ring the bell in New York." 48 hours later, the bomb detonated. Farah was in Fidelia's penthouse, sipping her morning espresso and reviewing the final prospectus, when her phone erupted. Within seconds, Fidelia's phone began ringing simultaneously. The headline on the Financial Chronicle was a blaring red banner: Ether Tech Scandal. Did billionaire Fidelia Kensington and Farah Hayes defraud investors in illicit takeover? Every major news network picked up the story within the hour. The fabricated emails were plastered across morning talk shows. Pundits who had praised Farah a week ago were now questioning her integrity, framing her as a manipulative gold digger who had used her husband's resources to build a nest egg for her billionaire lover. Fidelia stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Seattle skyline, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked visibly. He was radiating a terrifying, ice-cold fury. "I will bury OmniCloud. I will have Silas Montgomery in federal prison by midnight, and I will personally see to it that Richard Sterling never sees the light of day," Fidelia said, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. He was already typing out orders to his crisis management and legal teams. "We are filing a massive defamation suit." Farah remained seated on the velvet sofa. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a profound, exhausted anger. For 5 years, Richard had taken her credit. Now, he was trying to take her character. She looked at the doctored emails on her tablet. The syntax was a perfect mimicry of her writing style. The hacker had done a brilliant job, but Farah was not just a coder. She was an architect. She understood the deep, invisible architecture of the digital world better than anyone alive. "Fidelia, stop," Farah said, her voice piercing through his dark rage. He turned, his storm-grey eyes immediately softening as he looked at her. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his firm, warm grip. "I won't let them do this to you, Farah. You have fought too hard. I will destroy them." "A lawsuit takes years," Farah said, her analytical mind overriding her initial shock. "The SEC will still freeze the IPO based on the optics alone. Richard knows this. He doesn't need to win a trial. He just needs to delay the launch long enough for Silas to short our stock and bankrupt us." "Then what do we do?" Fidelia asked, entirely willing to follow her lead. A fierce, dangerous spark ignited in Farah's eyes. A hacker forged these emails, but to get the foundational data, my writing patterns, the metadata of my old Sterling Tech server logs, they had to breach my old, inactive accounts that I heavily encrypted before I left Richard. She stood up, walking toward her sleek, multi-monitor workstation in the corner of the penthouse. "They think they left no fingerprints," Farah said, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, bringing up lines of dense, glowing green code. "But they forgot that I wrote the security protocols they had to bypass. I left a tripwire in the root directory. If we find the IP address of the hacker, we find the wire transfers from Silas. We don't just deny the allegations, Fidelia. We execute them on live television." For the next 14 hours, the penthouse became a war room. Fidelia marshaled his vast resources, calling in favors from the highest echelons of cybersecurity defense, while Farah meticulously tracked the digital breadcrumbs Richard's hacker had carelessly left behind. By 3 a.m., the screen flashed with a final, undeniable data packet. Farah leaned back in her chair, a cold, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had the offshore bank routing numbers. She had the IP addresses. She had Silas Montgomery's encrypted text messages to Richard. She looked up at Fidelia, who had been watching her work with a look of absolute awe and reverence. "Checkmate," she whispered. The press conference was hastily called for 9 a.m., less than 24 hours before the EtherTech IPO. The grand atrium of Kensington Holdings was packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, financial analysts, and flashing cameras. The tension in the room was palpable. The world was waiting to see if the golden couple of the tech industry would crumble under the weight of the scandal. Sitting in his dingy motel room, Richard clutched a lukewarm cup of coffee, his eyes glued to the television screen. He felt a twisted, euphoric high. He had done it. He had brought the mighty Fidelia Kensington to his knees. On screen, the heavy oak doors at the front of the atrium opened. Fidelia and Farah walked out together. They didn't look defeated. They didn't look panicked. Fidelia wore a charcoal suit, looking like a king going to war, while Farah wore a stunning, tailored crimson dress that commanded the entire room's attention. She looked completely unfazed. They stepped up to the podium. Fidelia didn't even glance at his notes. "Good morning," Fidelia began, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Over the past 24 hours, Kensington Holdings and EtherTech have been the victims of a coordinated, malicious, and entirely fabricated smear campaign. I could stand here and deny these allegations, but I prefer to let the architect of our future speak for herself." He stepped back, giving Farah the floor. The flashing of the cameras intensified, a blinding storm of light. Farah adjusted the microphone. She looked directly into the main broadcast camera, knowing exactly who was watching. "Yesterday, documents were leaked to the press, suggesting corporate espionage and fraud," Farah said, her voice clear and ringing with ironclad confidence. "These documents were incredibly sophisticated forgeries." A murmur rippled through the press corps. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal shouted, "Ms. Hayes, do you have proof of forgery, or is this just damage control?" Farah smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm expression. She pressed a button on the podium. Behind her, a massive 50-foot LED screen illuminated. It didn't show a prepared PR statement. It showed a raw, highly detailed schematic of digital transactions and server logs. "We don't just have proof," Farah announced, her voice echoing through the silent atrium. "We have the architect of the fraud. Displayed behind me are the verified, decrypted server logs originating from an IP address in Tacoma, Washington, directly linking Richard Sterling to a known cyber mercenary group. Furthermore, we have traced an offshore wire transfer of $2 million, routed through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands." The screen shifted, displaying the banking details, redacting only the highly sensitive account numbers, but leaving the names glaringly visible. The funds used to pay for this fabricated smear campaign were supplied by Silas Montgomery, CEO of OmniCloud, in a desperate, illegal attempt to manipulate the market and short EtherTech stock ahead of our IPO. The press room exploded. Journalists were screaming questions, furiously typing on their laptops. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was the exposure of a massive federal crime. "As of 8 a.m. this morning," Farah continued, her voice cutting through the chaos, "all of this evidence has been handed over to the FBI, the SEC, and the Department of Justice. Warrants have already been issued." In his motel room, Richard dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the cheap carpet, brown liquid seeping into the fibers. He couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. He scrambled for his phone to call Silas, but before he could even unlock the screen, the heavy, metallic sound of a battering ram echoed down the motel hallway. "FBI! Open the door!" a voice boomed, followed by the splintering crash of the door frame giving way. Back at the press conference, Farah stepped away from the podium, leaving the undeniable evidence burning on the screen behind her. Fidelia stepped forward, wrapping a protective, deeply affectionate arm around her waist. EtherTech will proceed with its IPO tomorrow morning, as scheduled, Fidelia stated, glaring at the cameras. Let this be a lesson to anyone who believes they can manipulate, steal from, or intimidate the woman standing beside me. You will not survive the attempt. 6 months later, the chaos of Seattle felt like a lifetime away. The afternoon sun draped over the terraced gardens of Villa del Balbianello in Lake Como, Italy, casting a golden, ethereal glow over the ancient stone and manicured cypress trees. The waters of the lake glittered like scattered diamonds. The EtherTech IPO had shattered records, making it the most successful tech launch of the decade. Silas Montgomery was facing 20 years in federal prison for market manipulation and wire fraud. Richard Sterling, utterly bankrupt and facing multiple felony charges, had accepted a plea deal that would keep him behind bars for a very long time, permanently barred from ever holding an executive position again. But Farah wasn't thinking about them. She stood at the end of a long, white floral aisle, wearing a custom Vera Wang gown composed of layers of silk organza and delicate chantilly lace. The dress caught the gentle Italian breeze, making her look like a modern goddess. At the end of the aisle stood Fidelia. He was looking at her, as if she were the only oxygen left in the world. As Farah walked toward him, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. She hadn't just reclaimed her life. She had built a new one, brick by brilliant brick, alongside a man who celebrated her strength instead of fearing it. When she reached him, Fidelia took her hands, his thumb gently brushing over the enormous, flawless diamond on her ring finger. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, his stormy eyes entirely clear, filled with nothing but absolute devotion. "We built quite the empire, didn't we?" Farah smiled softly, looking up at the man who had become her shelter, her partner, and her greatest advocate. "We built a kingdom," Fidelia corrected gently, leaning down to press a kiss to her forehead. "And every kingdom needs its queen." There is a specific kind of blindness that infects arrogant men, but there is also a profound clarity that comes to those who refuse to be kept in the dark. Farah Hayes was discarded as a silent, invisible shadow, told by a lesser man that her worth was tethered only to his success. But true brilliance cannot be legislated away in a divorce settlement, and true power does not require permission. By stepping into the light, Farah did not just reclaim her stolen legacy. She fundamentally rewrote the architecture of her own life. Beside a partner who recognized her mind not as a threat, but as an equal force of nature, she proved that the most dangerous mistake one can make is mistaking a woman's quiet grace for weakness. From the ashes of betrayal, she didn't just survive, she ascended, an undisputed queen in a kingdom of her own making.